When you think of Henry VIII's children, you probably picture ruthless Bloody Mary or glorious Elizabeth I. But there was another child, one whose brief reign would reveal a darkness that even his notorious father might have found disturbing. Edward VI, the boy king who inherited the throne at 9 years old, would transform from a seemingly innocent child into one of England's most authoritarian rulers before meeting an end so twisted that it would haunt the Tudor dynasty forever. The story you're about to hear isn't just about a sick boy dying young. It's about how absolute power corrupts absolutely, even in the hands of a child. What you'll discover about Edward's final days will challenge everything you thought you knew about the Tudor legacy. The year was 1537, and Henry VIII finally had what he desperately craved, a legitimate male heir. Edward's birth was celebrated across England as the answer to decades of dynastic uncertainty, but his arrival came at a terrible cost. His mother, Jane Seymour, died just 12 days after giving birth, leaving the infant prince motherless and making him even more precious to his increasingly paranoid father. Before we descend into 6 years of what court records suggest was genuinely disturbing rule by a religiously radicalized teenager, hit that subscribe button for Medieval Spirits, because what you're about to discover is how Edward VI, born 1537, motherless, after 12 days when Jane Seymour died, was isolated from normal childhood and surrounded by radical Protestant tutors who from age 6 taught him theological treatises about evils of Catholicism. How, by age 8, he could recite complex theological arguments for why Catholics deserved death. How, at age 9, 1547, when Henry VIII died, within weeks of coronation, he was personally reviewing death sentences and smiling when signing death warrants. How, when an advisor suggested allowing Catholic nobles private worship, Edward threw his inkwell at him, screaming God would punish England. How servants found torture diagrams in his chamber, annotated with effectiveness commentary while he studied Spanish Inquisition interrogation techniques. How, at age 10, he composed sermons calling for complete elimination of Catholic influence. How a page who spilled wine was forced to stand in courtyard while courtiers threw rotten food, Edward watching with obvious pleasure, taking notes on victims' reactions. How a kitchen maid died after flogging for allegedly practicing Catholic prayers. Edward's comment, correction proved more effective than anticipated. How he called half-sister Mary the bastard and drafted detailed execution scenarios. How, when Uncle Thomas Seymour was executed, Edward watched from window making notes about effectiveness of different execution methods. And how at age 1553, dying from tuberculosis plus likely arsenic poisoning from physician's treatment, his final weeks saw greenish skin, hair falling out, foul body odor, while he drafted execution lists and cursed Mary with his last breath. This is how religious indoctrination from age 6 created what court records suggest was a child who treated human suffering as intellectual exercise. Now let's go back to 1537 and watch absolute power without emotional development transform a motherless prince into England's nightmare. From his earliest days, Edward was treated not as a child, but as England's future salvation, surrounded by guards, tutors, and courtiers who reminded him constantly of his divine destiny. This isolation from normal childhood experiences would prove to be the first step in creating what contemporary observers described with growing alarm. Unlike his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, who had both experienced their father's wrath and rejection, Edward knew only praise and adoration. Henry VIII, perhaps feeling guilty about his treatment of his daughters, showered his son with attention and affection that bordered on worship. The young prince was given the finest tutors money could buy, but these weren't ordinary teachers. They were radical Protestant theologians, chosen specifically to mold Edward into the perfect Protestant king. From the age of 6, Edward was studying not just Latin and Greek, but detailed theological treatises about the evils of Catholicism and the divine right of Protestant monarchs to rule. The education that Henry VIII arranged for his son was more like indoctrination than learning. Edward's primary tutor, John Check, was a brilliant scholar but also a religious extremist who filled the boy's head with visions of England as a New Jerusalem purified of Catholic corruption. Every lesson, whether in history, philosophy, or statecraft, was filtered through this lens of Protestant supremacy and royal absolutism. By the time Edward was 8 years old, he could recite complex theological arguments for why Catholics deserved death and why any opposition to his future rule would be tantamount to opposing God himself. Picture this educational environment. You're 6 years old, motherless since 12 days after birth, surrounded by adults who treat you with reverence rather than affection. Every tutor, every courtier, every lesson reinforces the same message. You are God's chosen instrument on earth. Catholics are enemies of Christ. Any compromise with them betrays divine will. You're studying theological treatises that justify execution while other children are learning to play. By age 8, you can construct elaborate intellectual arguments for why certain people deserve death, delivered with the same confidence you might recite multiplication tables. You have no friends your own age, no normal relationships, no experiences outside this bubble of theological certainty and royal absolutism. What made Edward's upbringing particularly dangerous was how it combined intellectual sophistication with complete emotional isolation. While he could debate theology with university professors, he had never played with other children or experienced normal human relationships, creating a boy who understood complex political theory but had no grasp of human empathy or the value of individual life. And when Henry VIII died in 1547, this 8-year-old theological scholar with zero emotional development suddenly became King of England. In the autumn of 1547, England found itself ruled by a 9-year-old boy who had been raised to believe he was God's chosen instrument on earth. Edward VI ascended to the throne following his father Henry VIII's death, inheriting not just a crown, but a kingdom torn apart by religious upheaval. The young king had been molded by the most radical Protestant tutors his father could find, men who filled his head with visions of religious purity and absolute authority. Unlike his older sisters Mary and Elizabeth, who had experienced their father's wrath firsthand, Edward had been sheltered, praised, and told from birth that he was destined for greatness. This combination of divine authority and childish petulance would prove deadly for thousands of his subjects. From his very first council meetings, Edward demonstrated an unsettling combination of childish petulance and cold calculation, interrupting experienced advisors to lecture them about Protestant doctrine. What struck contemporary observers was how quickly the 9-year-old king began asserting his authority. Within weeks of his coronation, Edward was personally reviewing death sentences and showing disturbing enthusiasm for executions of those he deemed heretical. Court records from this period reveal a child who treated matters of life and death like intellectual exercises, debating the theological justifications for various punishments with the same detachment he might discuss Latin grammar. Witnesses reported that Edward would often smile when signing death warrants, apparently pleased with his own cleverness in finding scriptural justification for each execution. The boy king's early months were marked by what courtiers privately called religious tantrums, explosive fits of rage whenever anyone suggested moderation in religious policy. Edward had absorbed his tutor's lessons so completely that he genuinely believed any compromise with Catholic practices was a personal betrayal of Christ. When his advisors suggested allowing some Catholic nobles to continue private worship, Edward reportedly threw his inkwell at the man and screamed that God would punish England for such weakness. These incidents were initially dismissed as childish behavior, but they actually revealed the forming of what some described as a genuinely dangerous religious fanatic. You're probably wondering how a 9-year-old could could possibly review death sentences and smile while signing execution orders? The answer reveals everything about what John Czech's indoctrination had created: a child who viewed human suffering through a purely theological lens, treating executions as intellectual puzzles, where finding scriptural justification was more important than the actual human being about to die. And his private activities suggested something even more disturbing about how this theological education
move
was
to secure
manifesting.
the family's
Perhaps
future.
most disturbing was Edward's apparent lack of normal, childish interests. While other 9-year-olds played with toys, Edward spent his free time reading accounts of the Spanish Inquisition and taking detailed notes on interrogation techniques. His personal servants reported finding drawings in his chamber depicting various torture methods, annotated with Edward's commentary on their effectiveness for extracting confessions from heretics. The boy, who should have been learning to ride horses, was instead studying the most efficient ways to break human bodies and spirits in service of his Protestant vision. What made Edward particularly dangerous was his combination of religious fanaticism and royal authority. While his advisors plotted and schemed around him, the boy king absorbed every lesson about the divine right of kings with terrifying enthusiasm. He kept detailed journals of his reign, and these documents reveal a child who delighted in descriptions of executions, religious persecutions, and the suffering of those he deemed heretics. By age 10, Edward was personally composing sermons that were delivered in churches across England. Sermons that called for the complete elimination of Catholic influence and promised divine punishment for anyone who showed mercy to heretics. The young king's cruelty wasn't limited to religious matters. Edward demonstrated a vindictive streak that shocked even hardened courtiers who had served his ruthless father. When servants displeased him, Edward would devise elaborate punishments that seemed designed more to humiliate than to correct behavior. One unfortunate page who spilled wine on Edward's papers was forced to stand in the courtyard for hours, while courtiers threw rotten food at him, all at the specific direction of the 11-year-old king. Edward watched these humiliations with obvious pleasure, often taking notes on the victims' reactions, as if conducting scientific experiments. Picture this page. Punishment from the victim's perspective. You're a teenage servant who accidentally spilled wine while refilling the king's cup. Within minutes, you're dragged to the courtyard, forced to stand in the center while the 11-year-old king watches from his window. Courtiers, grown men who should know better, throw rotten vegetables, spoiled meat, anything they can find. You're covered in filth, humiliated before the entire court. And when you glance up at the window, you see the boy king taking notes in his journal, documenting your reactions with the same clinical interest he might observe in insects. The boy king's journal entries from this period reveal a mind becoming increasingly detached from normal human emotion, and what happened to a kitchen maid would demonstrate just how far this detachment had progressed. Edward wrote about the sufferings of others with the same clinical detachment he used to describe the weather, noting details of pain and fear as interesting observations rather than tragedies. When a kitchen maid died after being flogged on Edward's orders for allegedly practicing Catholic prayers, the young king's only recorded comment was to note that the correction proved more effective than anticipated in removing the subject from further error. Edward's treatment of his own family provided perhaps the clearest indication of his growing sociopathy. Despite being raised alongside his sisters during early childhood, Edward showed no natural affection for Mary or Elizabeth once he assumed the throne. Instead, he viewed them through the same religious lens he applied to all his subjects. Mary was a dangerous Catholic who needed to be controlled or eliminated, while Elizabeth was a potential ally whose Protestant sympathies made her marginally more acceptable. Family relationships for Edward were purely political calculations. The transformation became even more apparent when Edward's uncle, Thomas Seymour, attempted to gain influence over him through gifts and flattery. Rather than being swayed by kindness, Edward saw Thomas's overtures as attempts to manipulate him and responded with cold calculation. When Thomas was arrested on charges of treason, Edward not only supported his execution, but reportedly watched from his window as the man who had once been kind to him was dragged to the scaffold. Witnesses reported that the boy king showed no emotion as the axe fell, instead making notes in his journal about the effectiveness of different execution methods. As Edward entered his 12th year, his authoritarian tendencies intensified dramatically. The boy who had once seemed frail and bookish began asserting direct control over government policy, often overruling his advisors when he felt they were being too lenient. His Protestant reforms became increasingly draconian, with mandatory church attendance enforced by networks of informants and severe penalties for any deviation from approved doctrine. Edward personally designed a system of religious surveillance that would have made the Spanish Inquisition proud neighbors. Encouraged to spy on neighbors, children rewarded for reporting their parents' religious transgressions. You're wondering how a 12-year-old designed an entire surveillance state. The answer lies in those years of studying Inquisition interrogation techniques and torture effectiveness. Edward wasn't just reading about religious persecution as abstract theology, he was studying it as practical methodology to be implemented across England. And his obsession with controlling every aspect of religious life was about to create what some observers described as a kingdom ruled by paranoia and fear. The king's obsession with control extended to every aspect of English religious life. Edward issued detailed regulations governing not just public worship but private devotions, dictating exactly how his subjects should pray, what they should believe, and even how they should think about God. Violation of these regulations was treated as treason against both crown and deity, with punishments that escalated from public humiliation to imprisonment to death. The boy king personally reviewed every case, often increasing the recommended punishments because he felt the original sentences showed insufficient zeal for Protestant purity. Edward established what were essentially thought police, encouraging subjects to report on their neighbors' religious practices with rewards for successful denunciations. The young king took personal pleasure in reading these reports, often summoning the accusers to court to provide additional details about their neighbors' supposed transgressions. Those found guilty of Catholic sympathies faced imprisonment, torture, or death, with the young king personally reviewing and often increasing the recommended punishments. Edward's court became a place where paranoia and fanaticism were rewarded, and mercy was seen as weakness. The machinery of persecution that Edward created was remarkable for its systematic nature and the king's personal involvement in its operation. Unlike adult rulers who might delegate such matters to subordinates, Edward insisted on reviewing every case personally, studying the details of each accused person's alleged crimes, and often devising specific punishments tailored to what he saw as their particular theological errors. His journals from this period read like manuals for religious persecution, filled with detailed discussions of which punishments were most effective for different types of heresy. What made Edward's persecution particularly chilling was how he combined childish creativity with deadly serious intent. When traditional punishment seemed insufficient, the teenage king would invent new forms of humiliation and suffering, always justified by elaborate theological arguments. One Catholic priest who refused to renounce his faith was forced to carry a sign reading "Enemy of Christ" through the streets of London while children threw stones at him, all at Edward's specific direction. The king watched this spectacle from his palace window, reportedly laughing at the priest's suffering while dictating observations to his secretary. Picture this priest's ordeal. You've spent your life serving God according to Catholic tradition, now forced to wear humiliating sign through London streets, while children taught by Edward's sermons that Catholics are enemies of Christ throw stones at you. Blood runs down your face, but what's worse is looking up at the palace window and seeing the 13-year-old king laughing, dictating notes about your suffering to his secretary as if your pain is educational material for his persecution manual. And Edward's cruelty toward family members would prove that blood relation meant nothing compared to theological purity. The king's obsession with religious purity extended to his own family in ways that revealed his complete lack of natural affection. Edward viewed his half-sister Mary, a devout Catholic, not as family but as the greatest threat to his Protestant England. In private letters that survived, Edward wrote about Mary with a hatred that was both childish and chilling, referring to her as the bastard and Christ's enemy while plotting ways to have her declared illegitimate or even executed for heresy. The boy who should have felt brotherly affection instead harbored fantasies of seeing his sister burn at the stake for her religious beliefs. Edward's hatred of Mary went beyond mere political calculation. It seemed to consume him with a personal intensity that worried even his most radical advisors. The young king spent hours devising scenarios where he could legally eliminate Mary from the succession, consulting with Protestant lawyers who were all too willing to find legal justifications for what amounted to fratricide. Court observers noted that Edward's mood would darken whenever Mary's name was mentioned, and he would often retreat to his chambers to write long screeds about the theological necessity of removing her from the line of succession. The boy king's plans for dealing with Mary became increasingly elaborate and cruel. Edward drafted detailed scenarios for Mary's arrest, trial, and execution, complete with specific charges of heresy and treason. He even wrote what he intended to be Mary's confession, forcing her to renounce Catholicism and acknowledge her illegitimate birth before being granted the mercy of a quick death by beheading rather than burning. These documents, preserved in the royal archives, reveal a mind that had moved far beyond normal political rivalry into genuine sociopathic hatred. Edward's treatment of Elizabeth was more complex, but equally disturbing. While he approved of her Protestant beliefs, he viewed his younger sister primarily as a useful tool for his religious agenda rather than as family. Edward planned to use Elizabeth's eventual marriage as a way to cement Protestant alliances, treating her future happiness as irrelevant compared to the political advantages her marriage might bring to his cause. Even his relatively positive feelings toward Elizabeth were filtered through his religious obsessions, making it clear that his sister's value to him was purely instrumental. You're probably wondering what could drive a teenage boy to draft detailed execution scenarios for his own sister, complete with forced confession scripts. The answer lies in 6 years of John Chake telling him that opposition to Protestant purity, even from family, was opposition to God himself, creating a mind where theological correctness mattered infinitely more than human relationships. And when Edward began showing signs of serious illness in early 1553, his behavior became even more extreme. When Edward began showing signs of serious illness in early 1553, his behavior became even more erratic and cruel. Rather than softening in the face of mortality, the 15-year-old king became obsessed with ensuring that his Protestant reforms would survive his death. He knew that Mary's accession would mean the restoration of Catholicism, and this knowledge drove him to increasingly desperate measures. The possibility of his life's work being undone by his Catholic sister filled Edward with a rage that bordered on madness, leading him to contemplate solutions that would have horrified even his tyrannical father. The young king's declining health seemed to intensify rather than moderate his extremism. As Edward grew weaker physically, his religious fervor burned even brighter, as if he were trying to compress a lifetime of Protestant purification into his remaining months. Edward began secretly meeting with Protestant extremists, plotting a coup that would bypass both Mary and Elizabeth in favor of his Protestant cousin, Lady Jane Grey. The conspiracy that emerged was breathtaking in its audacity and cruelty, involving plans to arrest or kill both of his sisters and install a puppet regime controlled by Protestant fanatics. The 15-year-old king, despite his physical weakness, threw himself into these planning sessions with an energy that amazed and frightened his co-conspirators. Working with John Dudley, the Duke of Northumberland, Edward crafted a plan that would have resulted in the deaths of both his sisters and the installation of a Protestant regime more extreme than anything England had ever seen. The conspiracy included provisions for mass executions of Catholic nobles, the seizure of all Catholic properties, and the establishment of a permanent religious police force that would monitor every aspect of English life. Edward's personal involvement in planning these atrocities was both detailed and enthusiastic. The dying king spent his final weeks drafting lists of Catholics to be executed, properties to be seized, and laws to be enacted in his Protestant paradise. His handwriting, increasingly shaky due to his illness, filled page after page with plans for what amounted to religious genocide. The boy who had once seemed like an innocent victim of political manipulation revealed himself to be the driving force behind a conspiracy that would have made the Spanish Inquisition look merciful by comparison. But Edward's illness had a cruel twist that seemed almost like divine retribution for his planned atrocities. Modern medical analysis suggests that the young king suffered from a combination of tuberculosis and what was likely arsenic poisoning, possibly administered by his own physicians, in a misguided attempt to treat his condition. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. The king who had poisoned England with religious hatred was himself being slowly poisoned by the very people trying to save his life. As the poisons slowly destroyed his body, Edward experienced hallucinations and periods of madness that were interpreted by his courtiers as religious visions. The boy who had shown no mercy to others spent his final weeks in agony, his body racked with pain as he slowly wasted away. And the manner of his death would prove that even physical suffering couldn't moderate the theological hatred that had consumed him since age 6. The manner of Edward's death was particularly horrifying for those who witnessed it. Court physicians recorded that the young king's body began to emit a foul odor weeks before his death, and his skin took on a greenish tint that suggested severe poisoning. Edward's hair and fingernails began falling out, and he suffered from violent convulsions that left him temporarily paralyzed. The boy who had once been considered one of the most beautiful of Henry VIII's children became a grotesque shadow of his former self, his body seemingly rebelling against the poison that was killing him. Perhaps most disturbing of all, the king remained lucid enough to understand what was happening to him, spending his final days alternating between screams of physical agony and fevered rants about Protestant martyrs. Edward's last coherent conversations were not about reconciliation or forgiveness, but about his regret that he wouldn't live to complete his planned purification of England. The young king's final hours were a grotesque parody of a deathbed scene. Instead of seeking forgiveness or expressing love for his family, Edward spent his last breath cursing his Catholic sister and praying for God to preserve Protestant England from what he called Mary's wickedness. Witnesses reported that his final words were not of peace, but of hatred, a fitting end to a life that had been consumed by religious fanaticism and political extremism. When Edward finally died on July 6, 1553, the relief among his courtiers was palpable, though few dared express it openly. The boy king, who had promised to be England's salvation, had instead become its nightmare, and his death offered the only escape from increasingly extreme policies that were driving the kingdom towards civil war. Subscribe to Medieval Spirits and share this video so others understand how ideological indoctrination of isolated youth creates capacity for systematic cruelty. Leave a comment telling me which historical period best demonstrates similar principles: childhood indoctrination, replacing empathy with ideology, surveillance states justified as religious purity, absolute power without emotional development, and intelligence weaponized for persecution rather than governance. Because here's the real lesson from Edward VI's six-year reign. When a motherless boy is isolated from age 6 and taught that Catholics deserve death, that opposition to his will equals opposing God, that human suffering is intellectual exercise in finding scriptural justification, you don't get a Protestant reformer, You get what court records suggest was a child who smiled, signing death warrants, and took notes on execution effectiveness. July 6th, 1553, his death may have been the greatest mercy his reign offered England, proving that sometimes theological certainty without human empathy is more dangerous than any external enemy.